I'm Karim Brown. Welcome back to The Fix. Let's dive right into our expert roundtable and chat about what you will be talking about this week coming ahead. Let's get straight to it. Welcome to my expert panel. We are about to say hello to Samkele Maseko. He's from ENCA. He's just come back from the KwaZulu-Natal ANC conference. We are also, of course, joined by Peter Bruce, the Sunday Times columnist, and a big warm welcome to a policy specialist, public policy specialist, my apologies, TK Puwe. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to The Fix.
Thank you.
Now, of course, this is the big story. This is the huge story that is making headlines, dodged a coup. And of course, it tells the story about the kind of behind-the-scenes maneuvering that was going on in the last kind of final twilight hours of former President Jacob Zuma's rule before Cyril Ramaphosa became a president. Let me start with you, TK. Do you think that this is a story that we should take very seriously, or is this the kind of usual conspiracies that kind of gain currency in organizations such as the African National Congress?
I think you probably hit it on the head there by saying it would be nice to have further proof. And if it is true, I guess it shows you what most liberation parties tend to do towards the end, where the last call is always the military to come in. Now, we hope and pray this is not true. And I think, but it's something which we should investigate to actually say, if somebody actually put this story out, well, obviously you can't ask journalists where the sources are, but is it something that's real? And because it can't be one of those things we just say, well, we hear it this Sunday and then we slide by, because it tells us that maybe we're not as great a constitutional state as we think we are, if such things could happen.
Peter, do you give any credence to the story? I mean, with all due respect, to the journalist that is writing it.
Well, I know very well, and I would have asked him a lot of questions about it if I.
Such as?
Well, tell me quietly who you got it from. Would have been one of them. It's a stretch here. The story. It's if you on a slow news day, it's going to make the front page. But I'm not sure that our armed forces were anything really near staging a coup. There might have been a few mutterings among some people, and I think Satuma Stone, who wrote the story, did say that these were largely MK people who seemed to be involved, and that might well be true. I don't know. In order to stage a coup in a country like South Africa, you've got to move a lot of equipment around very quickly, very expertly, and it's difficult.
I want to ask Samkele, I mean, you operate on the ground. You hear a lot of things that perhaps doesn't always make it to the newspapers. Do you think that there was ever any chance that the army was going to try and, become a political player in a constitutional state such as ours?
You can't rule it out. For instance, if you look at the history of the former President Jacob Zuma, not to say that he would go to that extent, only he himself and those who are close to him would know, but you can't rule it out because they themselves, as the MK-MVA, were split. For instance, you had the former MK-MVA chairperson or President KP Maphatwe, who was a very staunch backer of the then president at the time, who's seemingly gone very silent these days. MK-MVA basically somewhat led by Carl Niehaus these days as their spokesperson. But you never truly know what the extent of MK-MVA was and what influence they had. But as we have come to know in the past year or two, that MK-MVA was divided. We had the grouping of what Julius Malema terms as the very much underrated generals Piwe Nyanda, who comes from that era of the military veterans and the military wing here in South Africa, and MK-MVA, who was a staunch person backing President Cyril Ramaphosa and against former President Jacob Zuma. So there are those elements that you've got to pose against one another and ask yourself, really, would a KP Maphatwe be able to command an army to overthrow a certain government?
I must say, gentlemen, I mean, I think this story needs a lot more answers. For starters, we need a lot more on-the-record sources, both from the government as well as the African National Congress, the governing party. But I also think that it kind of feeds into this idea that there's always this kind of, threat to democracy coming from within the
Yeah.
African National Congress itself. And I think it's often fear-mongering. But let's move on. Peter, this week you wrote a column on Cyril Ramaphosa, and you're saying we're living through the real challenges. And you're saying that, you know, there's always been conflict, there's always danger, we're always on the precipice, but we always kind of make
Well, I
our
was
way
saying
back.
that he's living on the edge, not the rest of us, although by definition maybe we are. But you know, he does seem to be like a cork in a stormy sea. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah.
You guys, you've just come back from the KZN conference. I'd be really interested to hear you talk about, you know, how you think that went for him, because you were looking at it, you could say actually that was his slate. But there are other people who say no, this is a KZN Youth League slate, and actually, you know, the power has moved not towards Cyril, but may have moved towards Cyril, but it's sort of gone past him. And it's difficult to know where he is, and I wonder whether he knows where he is sometimes too.
Samkele, you've just come back from KwaZulu-Natal, of course, and much is being made about the leadership that has come in. Let's take a look at one of the sound clips that you filed, and I'd like to talk to you about the so-called generational mix, the younger people that apparently took over the province.
We think it spells out the bright future for the ANC in the province, for the ANC in the national space, but also for the people of KwaZulu-Natal. We really came to a determination that the ANC was really on a downward spiral, and as young people we had to rise up and save the ANC. We have always drummed up the message that the ANC is our future, and we have no future outside the ANC as our political home.
That's, of course, Mr. Mshengu speaking there. Now, this idea that the leadership under Sihle Zikalala has now come into its own, where the Youth League, the next generation, has finally taken control of the province. Is that your take as well, Samkele? And more importantly, if it is so, does it really mean anything different?
Karima, out of the 30 additional members that were elected into this PEC, 20 of them are current and former Youth League leaders. And I say current and former because the average age of those 20 members, if I'm not mistaken, is about 42. We've come to know the ANC as an organization.
But the funny thing is the youth in the ANC, your cutoff date is 36, so is this really youth?
Your cutoff date is 36, and that Youth League, I would say it's a generation that just about 10 years ago led the Youth League. Many people have said that the Nasrec conference should have been a conference where the likes of Malusi Gigaba led the ANC. So this conference that happened in KZN sets the tone of what will happen in the ANC conference come 2022. To answer Peter Bruce's question, I do believe and think that this conference that took place over the weekend is the doing of ANC's national organizer, Senzo Mchunu, linked with Zweli Mkhize. If you know the history of KZN and the history of these people that have been elected in this PEC, you would see that a huge chunk of them come from that era of the former regional chairperson of the ANC in eThekwini, John Mchunu, who passed away. Yeah. He was a strong ally then of Dr. Zweli Mkhize and Senzo Mchunu. Senzo Mchunu now organizes for the ANC. For instance, if you look at the re-election of Senzo Mchunu's wife in the Musa Dladla region, which came up with the name of Mike Mabuya Kulu for deputy chairperson and was unrelenting on their demand, to evidently looking at what transpired over the weekend, you would see that that core that belonged to the former president of the ANC and of the country, President Jacob Zuma, has been pushed away to additionals and no longer occupies any seat in the top 5. For instance, you look at Sihle Zikalala. Sihle Zikalala's politics for the longest of time going towards the Nasrec conference, he did not say which side, whether he was going between Cyril Ramaphosa or Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma until the last 3 months when he was pushed into a corner. So it does tell you that there is a movement.
Hold that thought for me. I want to ask you, TK, do you agree with Samkele? Because if I understand him correctly, he's essentially saying that the leadership collective that has come out of KZN is tied to the future political ambitions of two very important KwaZulu-Natal politicians, former Premier Senzo Mchunu, former Premier Zweli Mkhize, both in the National Executive now, and of course Dr. Mkhize, the Minister for COGTA. Does that mean that Cyril Ramaphosa is potentially going to face a challenge after his first 5 years in office?
I think the key thing first we need to get from is that are they themselves united? You know, it's very easy at the moment. I think that going into the election, the key thing that was coming out from KZN was the issue that, listen, we basically made mistakes leading up to the national election last year, and we actually need to get our house in order. Now, if that was the only thing that was uniting them, yes, it's very well and good. This could be maybe a new strategy to put in someone else. But I think there's still a lot of turmoil in the province as itself. I mean, yesterday's well, it's not called a political shooting, but I mean, the political violence around KZN is still a bit unsettled. So
another killing.
Another killing. And maybe just to go back to your first point, you know, about does this maybe younger version of the ANC in KZN actually mean anything? There's a James Bond movie. Q actually says something important. It says, youth is not a guarantee of innovation, as old age is not a guarantee of wisdom.
Yep.
And I think we have to actually look at this from a public policy point of view. I've actually tried to get away from looking at names to say, what do they represent from a policy point of view? And when you actually look at them, there's actually nothing.
That's the point.
There's
I mean,
nothing
Peter,
to say you can put to them.
Absolutely. Isn't that the critical issue? I mean, if this is a new generation, what does this generation stand for? I mean, have they said something publicly? Do they give an indication that they will be doing things differently?
I don't know. You know, I don't know them. The way Sam Keller was talking, I was so interested in the young man on the screen a moment ago too. Sounded like, you know, very sensible, thoughtful guy. And I mean, I think I would come out of a conference like that quite hopeful. Actually, I don't know whether that's silly of me.
Yeah, I mean, Samkele, the point that TK is making from a policy point of view, do these chaps that have been elected, do they stand for a different policy? And let's not get into the kind of rhetoric around radical economic transformation, because that could mean just about anything.
With all due respect, this boils down to how over the past 10 or 15 years, media has been so centralized around those who have been working at headquarters of organizations. For instance, if you look at the current Deputy Provincial Secretary of the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal, he's not a newcomer to politics. He was there during the era of Julius Malema in the Youth League when they were pushing for land expropriation without compensation, along with Kwazi Mshengu. So that generation of the current ANC PEC comes from that era largely. Most of them, about 60 or 70% of them, come from that era of Julius Malema in the ANC Youth League, of land expropriation without compensation, and the nationalization of mines. So that is their policy perspective. For instance, if you look at Sihle Zikalala in the interviews he did with one of our colleagues, Tula Sizwe, he spoke about a referendum for land. So that tells you that it's that era of what Karima is saying, the rhetoric of radical economic transformation, but infused with the policies of 2011 of the Youth League.
Let's look at the election, of course, also of the Gauteng provincial, conference. Very interesting. I mean, it was a fait accompli that David Makura was going to re-emerge and, of course, become now the actual chair. For me, what was really interesting, of course, is the election of Panyaza Lesufi, the current MEC for education, basic education, as the deputy. TK, is this a shift away from the power base of people like Paul Mashatile, or has this been an accommodation of power, seeing that Lebogang Maile didn't make it?
I think from top to bottom, these are still people you classify as, I think the local colloquialism they use is Paul Mashatile's guys.
Yeah.
Nothing has really changed. There was a bit of turmoil in terms of which way the sea was going to go. But I think when you actually look at them from top to bottom, including people like Bopak Style, they're still heavily associated with Paul Mashatile. What it did show is that maybe Gauteng has kind of learned from the mistakes of KZN, which to say, listen, to rock the boat is actually to hurt us more. And I think they, more than KZN, actually know what it's like to lose municipalities and also come close to losing the province. So it was an issue of saying, if we don't get our house in order here, next year is not guaranteed.
You know, somebody on Facebook asked me something really interesting, Peter. He said to me, so how is the people who were elected in Gauteng different from the ones that were elected, and do they represent anything different from the ones who lost? And I said, well, for starters, Panyaza Lesufi has a better public image than almost any MEC in Gauteng. This is a hands-on MEC. And Peter, you and I both know that politics is as much about perception as it is about power. A hands-on MEC, a man for whom no problem is big or small enough, he rolls up his sleeves.
Yeah, no, look,
your thoughts?
He's gone out of his way to make himself known, and he's been in a portfolio education where and it happens every year where be it enrollments in schools or whatever it might be, he's sort of thrust into the public, into the limelight, and he deals with it very well, and he is, as you say, proactive. If there's a problem at a school, he pitches up, and it's great.
Samkele, the Gauteng ANC has a tough job. I mean, it has to hold on to this province. This is the economic heartland. Can this provincial executive, as it's constituted, get that victory, that critical victory, if you consider the DA, despite the fact that the polls are saying something else, they still believe they can wrest power from the ANC in Gauteng?
Look, I wouldn't truly know if whether they have the manpower or the necessary political will, or there is an appetite by the general populace of Gauteng for this current leadership to take over. But what we have seen over the past few months in Gauteng is that there has been a growing frustration on the ground, particularly for those who are linked to the current, to the former provincial chairperson, I beg you, Paul Mashatile. I beg to differ with my colleague here when he says those people are largely associated with Paul, who are in the top 5. It would be arguably 2 of them. Jacob Kawe, the current provincial secretary, was elected, and Park Stow. But if you look at Panyaza Lusufi and David Makura, I would say they are not linked to the former chairperson Paul Mashatile, whom they are dubbed, some people call them the Alex Mafia. They are not. Largely, people believed that it's Lebohang Maile who was directly linked to Paul Mashatile. I've asked him that question, and he says, no, I am not. I respect Paul as the former chair of the province and the current Treasurer General of the African National Congress, and he's his own man. But many people in the African National Congress structures would differ. For instance, look at how Panyaza Lusufi's campaign kicked off. Panyaza started campaigning long before Nasrec, but nobody picked it up. Even myself, I did not. Until the 11th hour, the last 2 months towards the Gauteng ANC conference, he had done sufficient groundwork for himself and probably hooked up the West Rand and the Sidibeng region. And Tshwane, who would have thought that Tshwane would go for Panyaza Lusufi as opposed to Lebohang Maile? Joburg itself, the hub of where Paul Mashatile comes from, was divided between Park Stow, Lebohang Maile, and Panyaza Lusufi. So that tells you that David Makura is trying to build an ANC in Gauteng that's away from the current Treasurer General of the African National Congress, and an ANC that has his own identity. For instance, like what Sihle Zigalala is trying to do in KwaZulu-Natal by building an ANC that is youthful, that he knows, should he want to ascend to a higher office in 2022, it can either back him or back the former Treasurer General of the African National Congress, which would be Zweli Mkhize, or the former Chairperson, Senzo Mchunu.
TK, I'm going to give you the last 30 seconds because that's about what we have for this segment. This so-called generational push that Samkele is talking about taking place here and, of course, in KwaZulu-Natal as well, does it take the African National Congress in a different direction substantively on policy matters? Can it make this organization go for another 50, 100 years?
I doubt it, because we've actually not had an ANC Youth League for the last 3 years. And when you actually look at policy, I think sometimes people get into this belief that the ANC Youth League in terms of policy is what does it actually stand for. And I'm just looking at the issue of national politics. When you talk about unemployment, we don't actually have a specific legislation which speaks about unemployment. We still use the old politics of speaking about the old agencies which fund. And I want to just maybe contrast this to what's happening in the rest of the continent. When you speak about young people, if you look at SWAPO's got its problems, but its youth league is very much on point. And I think the issue is we haven't actually quite identified, when we say youth, well, what power do we actually ascribe to them beyond simply being voting cattle?
Absolutely. Well, that's where we leave it. I must say that I agree with you. Gentlemen, thank you so very much. These developments, of course, are going to impact the kind of politics and the developments that we see in the week coming up.